Hello and welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at Disaster Cover Journal. Today's sponsor is Everbridge, and the topic is Achieving Resiliency and Scalability in Times of Crisis. Before we get started, I wanted to review a couple housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded. This recording will be shared with everyone tomorrow via an automated email. Attendees are also in a listen-only mode. If you'd like to ask any questions, please use the question function located on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll answer as many of these questions as possible at the end of the session. Now I'd like to introduce you to Prashant Darisi. Prashant has over 2 decades of experience as a technology leader with proven management experience in strategic planning, roadmap execution, high-performance teams, and best practice methodologies. He is the Vice President of Product Marketing and Management for Everbridge's Enterprise Risk, IT Alerting, and Internet of Things suite of products. Prior to Everbridge, his leadership role entailed being responsible for the identity and governance product at RSA Security. And with no further delay, I'd like to turn the mic over to Prashant.
Thank you very much, Bob. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening based on the time zone you folks are. Today I'm traveling to Madrid, so it's about 8 p.m. for me. So that's why all sorts of greetings for you folks. Thank you very much for your time. Achieving resiliency, scalability in times of crisis. Now I'll make an opening remark which might sound controversial, but then we'll walk through the rest of the presentation and see if I can back some of that up. And what I claim and what I suggest is that feature functions of your critical event management platform is not important, right? And why do I say that? Let's walk through some of those. But before we get into, defining critical events and crisis, let's simply go and look at what a critical event is. And I think it's a very simple definition from anybody's perspective. There are good things that we all care about, right? There are things we want to protect. There are things that we care about. And then we know that unfortunately we live in a world where bad things happen all the time. And whenever these two universes intersect, right? When the things that we care about, whether it's people, assets, operations, or protecting your own brand, and anything that bad happens, we define that as a critical event. So essentially, what do we really do when critical events happen? And then how do we ensure that whatever plans we are putting in place in response to a critical event is something that is scalable, that's resilient, that's redundant, that's available, and we'll look at some of those concepts today. Now, many things keep us up at night, and they're all sort of interrelated. Some of you on this phone care about business continuity. A lot of you probably have a duty of care and worry about life safety at all times. Many of you might be cybersecurity folks or ITSM folks worried about your SLAs, outages, downtimes, and MTTRs. Others that are worried about events and critical things that are affecting your supply chain, right? Maybe you're worried about that diabetes drug that needs to reach the shore where a hurricane is bearing down, or an anti-cancer drug, or you're simply worried about public safety to make sure that nobody is left behind. You simply want to ensure that in times of crisis, you have a good emergency communication system in place. So it doesn't matter which domain we are looking at, the ability and any enterprise's readiness to respond to this critical event to make sure that the incident is understood well and handled is agnostic to what kind of domain you belong to. Now, if we look at the most common type of critical events, this is a study that we commissioned about a year and a half ago, and we simply went around asking executives across United States, what have you really experienced in the last 2 years? And you can see that the spread is, really bad. It starts from a simple weather event, predominant You can see the ratio is on IT systems failures, whether it is cybersecurity or some form of an outage. But executive protection, especially in the world that we live in, the worry about the pandemic or the potential pandemic of coronavirus or the protests and where people are going into hot areas, right? And then related to cybersecurity or related to all those activities and outages is the brand and reputation. I don't need to tell you which and who these companies are, but you've seen all of that. And whether it's a typhoon in China, Hurricane Dorian, wildfires in California, we all are worried about supply chain. And if anybody saw the news today, when Apple declared its results, the problems related to supply chain are evident all over the world. And unfortunately, we do experience the events of active shooter and some form or act of terrorism here and there. So these are the most common critical events that organizations, at least in the US, seems to have been subject to in the last 24 hours. And these are the things we worry about all the time. And you need to put together a plan, whether it is preparedness, a crisis management, a GRC policy, an ITIL definition, a cybersecurity plan, or a supply chain resiliency or security plan in place to make sure that you're in a good position to respond to these critical events. So let's really look at what a critical event could be. And sometimes we try to segregate the type of events into buckets and think that these are in silos unrelated to each other. Unfortunately, right, the world that we live in, both physical and digital critical events have multiple dimensions of pain. Right? We just went through and met somebody that said that a water main break flooded a basement that affected servers that were stored in the basement as backup, right? And so there are very hyper-local events that impact folks like you. We heard from many of our customers and executives that a protest on the street, made a lot of people flee. And even the non-protesters came into the building and entered the gates for safe haven. So now you have a bunch of citizens in your facility taking shelter, and that's a security risk from multiple perspectives. So whether it is any dimension of physical security, a cybersecurity event, right, they're all related. So the more and more we undergo digital transformation, the more and more we put systems together, the more and more CIOs get together to consolidate tools, right, and create what is known as the fusion centers of tomorrow, where you have your SOC, Security Operations Center, and your NOC, your Network Operations Center, all coming together. The dimensions of pain when a critical event occurs only increases. So unfortunately, we cannot look at these separate things in silos anymore. We need to have a cohesive way to attack all the critical events and make sure that we're responding, whether it is evacuating people, at the same time making sure that you're quarantining the networks, making sure you have the backups running well. All of that needs to happen in a well-orchestrated manner. So why is it so hard? One of the reasons it's so hard is the number of stimuli that people are getting. I mean, we know the entire story about social media, right? What's the difference between I'm on fire and there is a fire in the building? Guess what? Both the sentences have the word fire in it, right? How reliable is it, right? How qualified is it? Are you able to correlate it to it? Where is it? How far is it from me? That's very hard given the number of data sources that are out there. And then, does it really matter to what I care about? We started by talking about good things that we care about and want to protect and the bad things that are happening, right? Does the protest down the street affect me? Does the cybersecurity event bring the servers down, right? Should I be protecting myself from a manhole cover that blew up, right? What about a fire in the building? What about a traffic stop and a significant accident that occurred, right? And who is going to be in the area? It's not just what is happening right now. Do I have executives and people and my own employees traveling to a hotbed area? And I need to make sure. And then, who are the people who can help me, right? How do I put together a response team? This is challenging, especially when we start talking about geographically dispersed team. Almost everybody has disaster centers across the world, whether it is for cost reasons or for the follow the sun model. We have large enterprises making sure that they have support centers in China, India, Philippines, the European area, right? And now when a critical event occurs at off hours, how do I go and find the best response team? It is hard. Now, how do we make sure that once we've identified who is affected, whether it is employees, visitors, contractors, travelers, or even trying to put together a response team, how do we make sure they can actually collaborate together? What plans should be activated? Do I have a GRC policy that I'm supposed to be compliant with? Is there a crisis management plan that is documented somewhere? And really, a lot of the customers that we have spoken to and you perhaps have experienced, when we ask for a GRC policy, right, we will actually see a binder. A company I worked for had a GRC policy which was 3,000 pages deep. Can you imagine trying to find the correct procedures and the legislative compliance, ethical, corporate obligations that we're supposed to act upon when a critical event occurs? And then finally, our tomorrow has to be better than today, right? Every time a particular critical event happens, either you're supposed to file an after action report or a root cause analysis, but somehow there is an obligation on corporates, enterprises, public sector, governments, everybody to make sure that they learn from that critical event. And next time, either the same event or a similar type of event occurs, that you have put some principles of learnings to make sure that next time you're able to, perform better. This is very hard. Like I said, hundreds of data sources where the data comes from, geographically dispersed team, not knowing where the employees are, especially in this world where the force is increasingly mobile, right? Executive protection, and then acting upon copious and deep manuals, and then learn techniques of AI ops and machine learning and deep analytics to make sure that we can put some lessons into practice moving forward. This is genuinely a hard problem to solve. And we always talk about dwell time, whether it is cybersecurity or somebody getting into your network, or an outage of a service, or flooding in the basement, or Hurricane Dorian, or wildfire, or an active shooter situation. The longer we let the critical event dwell before we can start acting in response to it, the greater the negative impact to people, assets, and operations. So this genuinely is a challenging problem, like, many of you folks told Forrester in a slide or two that I showed before. Now, what's happening, and this is now an inevitability, that in face of these critical events, businesses are increasingly leveraging cloud-based technology solutions. Clearly, if we want some form of resiliency and redundancy, putting a server in a building that might get affected either by power outage or weather event or an evacuation or a fire is not the greatest way. So clearly there are significant advantages of leveraging technology solutions that sit in the cloud, but then they open a can of worms of their own. There are challenges which are significant and large, least of which is some of your data is leaving your own corporate walls and firewalls and sitting somewhere else in the control of someone else, right? So we know that this is inevitable, but what can we really do? And if you look at the solution, while this is a hard problem to solve, right, it's actually a simple three-step process. Whenever critical event occurs, the first thing we all need to be able to do is communicate well with each other. Communicate well with the responding teams, communicate well with your employees, communicate well with your visitors, communicate well with your contractors, communicate well with the stakeholders that need to know whether something is happening or not. So communication is step one. Two, once we've figured out what's the best team, inform them of the actions that they need to take put them together, whether it is a crisis management room, whether it is a collaboration room, whether it's a digital war room, doesn't matter what lexicon we use, but step two of trying to solve and respond to a critical event and behaving in the time of crisis is to make sure that the teams can collaborate. And finally, based on the nature of the incident, all corporations, all governments, public sector, no matter who we are, we all have to follow a certain business process. Whether it is compliance reasons that you're supposed to do, whether it is risk mitigation, whether we are following FEMA, whether we are following a cybersecurity, whether we are taking ITIL practice or anything that we are doing, we all have a business process to follow. A ticket goes from SEV 3 to a SEV 2 to a SEV 1. There is a very specific business process that we all are supposed to follow. So while we are communicating well with the people that are impacted and the teams that can help us, and we are putting a team together that can collaborate to get us out of this crisis, we also need to respect and follow and be compliant and orchestrate that business process. So really, if we look at the solution capabilities and had to put them in three buckets, I would say communicate better, collaborate well, and orchestrate the needed business process. And guess what? We're able to respond to a crisis quite well. Somewhere along these three buckets, you will pick up enough analytics to learn. And when you do your after action report or a root cause analysis, you will be able to help make your tomorrow look better. However, there is an issue here, right? And these features are clearly important. I did, for effect say that features are not that important. They are, of course. But if we are only look at feature functions, there is one thing that we are missing out. And that's very, very simple. The foundation of the solution is far more important, right? It's very hard to build a floor 10, floor 11 if the foundation is cracking. So our assertion is that the platform on which the solution is based is far more important than the solution itself. If your solution that you have put in place is not available, is subject to the same vulnerabilities that your response teams are subject to, it's subject to the same problems that we are trying to protect ourselves from, we are in bigger trouble than the feature function itself. So given that background, let me quickly jump into why we think the platform is perhaps more important than the act of communication, collaboration, and orchestration of the solution itself. And the prevailing perception, and we've seen this in a lot of solution websites, believe it or not, if you go to their websites, many of the vendors that probably people on this phone are leveraging right now, they will actually say, we follow the best practices. We are based on Google infrastructure. We are based on Amazon infrastructure, right? And they follow all forms of redundancies. If we think that just because the infrastructure on which our solution is based is good enough for us, we are in trouble. And we'll talk a little bit about that moving forward here today. Now, let's look at these 8 companies here. Now, the reason I put these logos up here is not to say that these are bad logos. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. These are the best of breed solutions that are out there. But as you folks know, right, this is just in 2019. So many solutions are based on what we are looking at here. As you know, in Salesforce, right, it's public knowledge now. By mistake, a database or a development script ran on the back end and mistakenly elevated the privileges of normal users and gave them privileged access, right? In response to that, they had to block a bunch of users and then quarantine the entire network to prevent any further damage. We all know, while Hurricane Dorian was happening last year, Amazon Northeast region in the Virginia belt, they lost 7.5% of their servers, right? We've seen outages in Office 365 and the Microsoft Azure cloud, right? So all these examples that we have here, while there have been hundreds and outages of there, thousands in fact. We're just talking about the top outages in 2019 that shook all of us, right? So just trusting your infrastructure provider to make sure that your solution that you've built on top of it, whether it's crisis management, whether it is incident response, whether it is security orchestration, right, or it's public alerting, emergency notification, your supply chain resiliency solutions, it's a little dangerous to do so. While we believe that these companies do their best to provide the best service to all of us, we do need to build a further layer of resiliency and scalability to ensure that we are delivering our best value to the customers that depend on our solutions. So, given that, I believe that all vendors in this space that are in some form of solution offering, whether it is business continuity, whether it is life safety, whether it is supply chain risk, whether it is IT operations, whether it is emergency communications, all these vendors must challenge themselves to step up more than they have in the years past. And in return, our customers, any customers that buying a solution from these vendors must challenge the vendors themselves, right? And so every vendor that walks into your door, you have to ask them if they are up for the challenge in delivering high resiliency and scalability to you folks. So we believe that there are three things that are completely non-negotiable. Now, there are varying degrees of resiliency, varying degrees of scalability, varying degrees of performance that you might be all right with. But from a pure principle perspective, philosophically, these three things are non-negotiable. And these three things are not just dependent on the infrastructure provider, but the solution stack has to provide these three goals and meet them or exceed your expectations as a customer or somebody that's depending to make sure that in the event of crisis, you have a solution that can help you come out of it as quickly as possible. So let's start looking at some of the factors that we should be looking at. We'll break it down into certain categories, and then we'll go down into some of the mitigating factors that you should be looking at. And then we'll also look at what best looks like. And we'll try to walk the good, better, best journey, and then we can figure out based on your solution need what works for you. Clearly, redundancy of operations and services, and we'll dive a little deeper into it. Scalability through SaaS, that I think is a given, right? Complete system monitoring, not just pinging, not just trace route, not just a heartbeat, but complete system monitoring, and we'll dive deeper into that as well. And then how do we overcome the shortcomings of the available infrastructure? So we saw some of the marquee logos a couple of slides before this. Just depending upon them, despite their best efforts, is subject to a vulnerability that I don't think we can afford anymore. So how do we overcome the shortcomings of the available infrastructure? And while all this is happening, we know this for a fact. All our businesses are growing. If anything, more of the digital transformation is going on. Some of the biggest budgets in the boards these days are for initiatives under that big tag called digital transformation. More and more is getting automated. More and more is getting digitized. More and more is getting into data centers. How do we make sure that as the needs grow, as more people come in, and when a confluence of multiple critical events happen, how do we scale? And especially scale in a global fashion. And finally, something that should never be taken. And if we talk to any of the companies that offer cybersecurity solutions, the one mantra they'll always say is that it's not a question of if you will get breached. It's not a question of if somebody is going to hack you. All the cybersecurity vendors, top 15, top 20, top 25 will all say when. It's a question of when. And so security and compliance certifications of the solution and the platform that you depend on are again of paramount importance when we're talking about times of crisis. So let's quickly start looking at redundancy of operations and services. Clearly, availability is simple, right? However, we should not settle for anything less than 4 nines. In fact, the utopia for 4 nines is that even during maintenance windows, especially as we become more and more sophisticated in our cloud technologies, our deployment methodologies, continuous integration, continuous deployment, vendors should not be given the excuse of saying, oh, my system will be unavailable during a maintenance window. That should not happen at all. What if the critical event happens exactly during the maintenance window? Just to give you a simple example, the difference between 3 nines and 4 nines is about 8 hours. Now, there are a bunch of statistics out there, anywhere from $9,000 per minute of downtime to a dwell time of millions of dollars of losses. Like a hotel chain recently that got breached, I don't need to tell their names, right? When they got breached, they're already subject to $28 million of losses. Furthermore, I'm right now sitting in Madrid. In the European time zone, they're also subject to fines. So eventually, by the time it is said and done, in terms of pure dollar amount on a single event, right, or a single outage that we talked about, it probably will cost them $130 to $140 million. And we haven't even talked about brand reputational costs. These are just hard numbers, right? So the redundancy is key. Now, the network operation centers, the data centers, they are already proven to be vulnerable to the exact same critical event that we are all trying to resolve, right? Therefore, our suggestion is to choose multiple geo-redundant centers that are continuously data syncing. There are a lot of geo-redundant data center offerings out there that will do data sync once a day, 2 times a day, 3 times a day. I don't think we can afford that, right? Especially when we're talking about movement of people, right? Critical events, data that is coming in, figuring out who is where, what is our duty of care to our people, where are our most significant assets, right? Which networks need to be quarantined, what services are being offered, what kind of CMDB data lookup product service location we are looking at. We need continuous data sync, geo-redundancy. Again, let's go back to that Amazon outage, right? 7.5% in the East-1 corridor. Imagine if you didn't have geo-redundancy. You would be in big trouble, right? Now, just physical redundancy is just not enough anymore, right? That means heartbeat, ping, servers, hard disk. No, not enough. Every single component, whether it is user interface, whether it is the API layer, whether it is your testing with synthetic transaction on end-to-end system, web servers, middleware, backend database, every single component needs to have a layer of redundancy. And typically customers will see solutions where just the backend is redundant. User interface may not be. Maybe the user interface is redundant and the backend is, but maybe they're not the middleware. Maybe the middleware is redundant, but the monitoring systems are not redundant. So when something goes down, you never get the alert. So just looking at physical redundancy is no longer enough. Every single component must be redundant. And then we can get to utopia here. We're not suggesting you invest in this. However, if you can find alternate service providers that you can instantly switch to when you see an outage, that's utopia. And by the way, there are folks out there that are offering these services, whether it is telecom infrastructure from this country to another, Europe, right? Moving messages across geos, or even becoming agnostic to the infrastructure that you're depending on. If you have the ability to switch to your service providers based on the criticality of the operation, that's utopia. So that's about redundancy of operations and services. Scalability through SaaS and the cloud, I think it's well understood, right? No longer do we suggest to have a single on-prem solution. However, many of the traditional SaaS solutions are still bottled by fixed capacity. right? There's an act of provisioning that needs to happen every time the fixed capacity occurs. We must look here for algorithms, solutions, machine learning, and analytical techniques that can see the traffic, the volume, the spikes that are coming in, and elastically expand the infrastructure on demand. There shouldn't be a human intervention to say, I'm seeing traffic, I'm seeing CPU spike, I'm seeing memory usage, let me go and provision, expanded infrastructure. This must happen elastically. This must happen in a utopian phase. This is hard, folks. This is really hard. But the utopia is, can you make your solution cloud agnostic? Tremendous level of investment needed, but really, if we want to get to that level, right, no matter what cloud infrastructure provided you, if you can switch, right, on demand, that's utopia when we're looking at cloud-based technology solutions. Now let's discuss a little bit about, system monitoring. Monitoring capacity is obvious. Everybody looks at CPU. Everybody looks at memory. Everybody looks at communication infrastructure. Everybody wants to know if the network is up. Everybody wants to know if your voice is working or not. However, every component needs to be looked at. If a particular vendor solution has an API layer, and a lot of customers are leveraging API layers, is the API layer up? Or if the API layer is up, a lot of customers are leveraging user experience and user interfaces and web portals. Well, maybe the API layer is up, or maybe not, the UI is up, right? Maybe the UI is up, the API is up, the backend database is up. But in the event of a critical event, somehow the phone infrastructure is down, right? Maybe the telco provider is not available. The SMSs are not going through. The voice calls are not going through where they're supposed to go. Maybe the mobile app is down. So when we look at monitoring systems, we must look at multiple dimensions of monitorability, right? Whether it is a headless operations, whether it is user experience, both on a desktop or mobile app, we need to make sure that we are continuously testing them. And then to do end-to-end delivery validation, right from the detection of a particular event to your ability to communicate to your customers, to your stakeholders, to the teams that are responsible for resolution. We must be able to monitor the complete walkthrough end-to-end. And the best way could be to prove this from outside your own monitoring ecosystem. A lot of you folks might be leveraging the tools that you have put together. Your mobile phone lights up when something fails, but what if your own monitoring system goes down, right? Can you prove that you can simulate end-to-end response network? Can you simulate public service networks? Can you simulate a cell phone SMS, right? Or you just want to test the scalability of the system. If you think that you're supposed to be responsible for the duty of care of all your global employees, if you're responsible as a mayor for an entire city, a governor for the entire state, can you simulate all the recipients? Hurricane Dorian bearing down, right? Can you simulate the entire population of Florida? Wildfires affecting California, can you simulate the entire population of California that you think is getting affected? So when we talk about resiliency and availability, scalability factors come into the fact that if you're not scalable, you're not reliable. Just being available is not good enough. You must be available and you must be scalable in the times of crisis. Now, let's discuss, the example of what happened. Last year, when Hurricane Dorian hit, I don't know how many of us remember, exactly at the same time, Houston was flooded. Exactly at the same time, there were wildfires in California. Exactly at the same time, there were 3 shooting incidents across North America. Can you imagine how we are taxing the public infrastructure, the public communication network, and the cloud-based vendor infrastructure providers everybody's trying to communicate. Everybody's impacted. Everybody has a loved one that lives in one of these locations. Everybody has executives, employees working in geo-dispersed locations. Everybody has executives traveling here. Everybody's children go to schools in these regions. And so the entire planet gets taxed from an infrastructure perspective. And we as vendors and you as customers must challenge us to make sure that we have evidence that we can overcome the shortcomings of the infrastructure that's available out there. Now, what typically happens, right, whether it is queue management, service level agreements, QoS and quality of service, typical solutions will include call throttling. They will use basic call throttling and congestion management. We must obviously do that. But the algorithms that solutions must provide should be a combination of multiple things. We must not just throttle the call because by mistake, we might throttle that one important call that can save a life. That one important call that can quarantine your network and protect your data, your assets, right? So we must combine multiple dimensions of factors to make sure that we can overcome the available infrastructure. Anywhere from throttling to routing to making sure there are rate limits, or even get into a simulation mode, right? Figure out if all these bad things were to happen, impacting the good things that we care about, can we set intelligent algorithms to say, hey, based on the nature of the incident, the number of stimuli that are coming in, the number of events, the type of severity, and the priority that I'm noticing, can I have a predetermined set and best practice that I can automatically execute without having to think at the time of crisis on how I should behave and respond to this? So these are some of the things that we must be looking at the solutions that we're depending upon during the time of a crisis. Let's talk about scalability. We did touch upon it quite a few times here, but this is a very, very interesting quote that I read. And it's actually true, right? During the time of crisis, when we are all stressed, a lot of our mental faculties that we depend upon during normal business, our analytical ability, our ability to listen clearly, our ability to assimilate information, our ability to react well during a time of crisis, under duress, during times of stress, they are significantly diminished. And so while we are talking scalability, monitoring, availability, what are the other things that we need during the times of crisis, right? Clearly, it's global distribution, right? So now if you have employees that are English speaking, you have employees that are speaking 5 or 6 different languages around the globe. You're sitting in one place as a supplier, but the distribution network goes through a series of geo-distributed locations, right? What do we need to do? But these are the factors. We look at it all the time. While we are scaling the environment, we must respect diversity. We must become inclusive. We must respect what people are most comfortable with. If somebody that's more comfortable in speaking Portuguese gets an English-based message on how that person should react during a time of crisis, like we've looked at it, their ability to respond does diminish. And right now, what we are looking at in China, right, which is rapidly growing in size, hopefully for all our good, we quickly overcome this and diminish this. But clearly, as we are communicating with folks that are in ships in Japan, supply chain effect, ships that have moved out of that area and coming to this part of the world, we must be able to respect the local requirements, right? Dialects, languages that are familiar to the recipient, and we should be able to scale in time. We must be able to scale real time and do it instantly. The same trigger of detection, the same trigger of communication, the same trigger of collaboration, the same trigger of orchestration must be able to translate the same message into multiple languages, multiple dialects, and multiple modalities. And here, scalability becomes really important because once we cross the borders and start depending upon infrastructure and service providers, the relationship between you and the regional provider is sometimes more important than technology. I can't tell you how many times we have seen friction between two political governments, right? And messages get suppressed, right? A sanction here, a tariff here. You will put tariff on me, I put duty on you. I'm going to choke your message and subject you to soft penalties. We've seen this all the time, right? So trade wars, friction politically between nation countries, this is where our relationship as vendors with the regional providers help us overcome the needs to scale very quickly. And finally, understanding that as we communicate, as we move data, as we move messages, as we make people collaborate on crisis events and share information about those critical events, we have to respect privacy, the regional jurisdiction, and the undeniable needs to make sure that all this happens to be in a secure environment. That's key to scalability and scalability in a global environment. There is no utopia when it comes to security and compliance certification. So we won't name names here, but there are three massive outages, events, or incidents that all of us are aware of. Perhaps one of the largest retailers in the world, one of the largest home stuff store in the world, one of the largest hotel chains in the world. The interesting thing here, if you look at the anatomy of the outage, if you look at the anatomy of the breach, if you look at the anatomy of the critical event that these folks were subject to, believe it or not, none of them actually had their own infrastructure compromised. It was always somebody that these three people dependent on, right? Whether it is a breach, whether it is an outage, whether it is a building in which they were housed and it was a leased building and the facilities being the responsibility of somebody else, in every single instance, while your application firewall, your DMZ, your network zone, your crisis management plan, your people, and you were never compromised, but you always depended on somebody that became a threat vector. So when we look at security and compliance certifications, the one question all vendors should be asked is, how secure are you? Because we as customers cannot afford you to be a threat vector. Because remember, nobody remembers that third party that got breached, but everybody remembers the name of the retailer. Nobody remembers where the outage occurred and the credit cards and the debit cards stopped working. But everybody remembers the name of the bank, right? The social media lights up with negative, connotations, big buzzwords, and that negatively affect your reputation and your brand. Nobody remembers that third-party vendor. Everybody remembers the name of the customer. So you as customers cannot do business with vendors that themselves can become a threat vector to your business. And therefore, there is no utopia. Security is completely non-negotiable, right? And the burden of proof in providing that capability entirely rests on the vendor. No longer is it good enough to say, we follow the same best practices that ISO 27001 follows. No. No longer good enough. You must have that certification. We are in the process of, SOC 2 compliance. not good enough. We're in process for FedRAMP, not good enough. Oh yeah, our infrastructure provider is GDPR compliant and our data store sits in our infrastructure provider's infrastructure. Therefore, we think we are GDPR compliant, not good enough. As we have proven in 2019, again and again and yet again, right? Vendors cannot be the threat vectors, and vendors can no longer get away by saying that somebody else is responsible for the security of my solution stack, top to bottom. So, folks, there are four key things that are very key to a successful incident response. We must have the best ability to understand and assess the critical event in the times of crisis. What is really happening? How do I separate all the noise? What about this whole thing about false news, false stimuli, right? Should I believe every trigger that I get? Should I believe every Twitter that I see? Can I differentiate between I'm on fire today versus the building is on fire? The first step and a first ingredient to a successful incident response in the time of crisis is to make sure we understand the context and the severity of the event. Second is to make sure that we can locate not only the people that are impacted, but also the people that can help us get out of this crisis, that are geographically distributed, have their own shifts, have their own calendars, speak different types of dialects and languages, and then making sure that we put them all together to collaborate and make sure they act in accordance to the policies and the procedures that are put in place, and eventually make sure that throughout the process of assessing, locating them, acting in the right manner, we are in a position to continuously analyze while the crisis is ongoing and after the crisis is over, to make sure that next time a similar event occurs, we're able to assess better, we're able to locate faster, we're able to act quicker and be more efficient, and then feed that analysis engine and get into this mode of continuous improvement. These are the key ingredients to a successful incident response. However, the ingredients must be based on certain factors. And this is where you folks as customers must challenge us as vendors to deliver the best of breed, end to end. High availability and scalability, not just the infrastructure level, not just at the UI level, every single component of the solution stack. Full stack redundancy is what we call. Must make sure that we can communicate with people in major modalities. If for some reason SMS is down, something else should work. If voice calls don't work, something else should work. If the people that you need to communicate have their phones switched off, something else should work. So multiple modalities, multiple voice providers, redundant paths to make sure that you can guarantee deliver communication collaboration during the times of crisis. Make sure that the network operation centers that you're dependent are redundant themselves. Ideally, staff 24/7 by 365. The worst thing that can happen at the time of crisis is you pick up the phone and want to talk to your network operation center, and you get an operator that says, "Thank you for your phone call. I will reach to the people, wake them up, and get back to you." Ideally, you're looking at full staffing that has live support teams. Not a concept of an operator, not a concept of somebody, "Hey, I have, flu, my child is sick." Somebody picks up the phone and says, "Thank you, tell me your basic symptoms. In 10 to 20 minutes, the nurse practitioner will call you." After that, "Oh, I got all your data. Now the doctor will call you." But in the times of crisis, in this world of digital transformation, I don't think we can afford that dwell time of this layered way of reaching the people that can actually help. And then eventually making sure that we have the best of breed security and compliance. These folks are completely non-negotiable. So we have the key ingredients that we talked about. but a platform that can provide value across this chain, then we are looking at true resiliency. Then we're looking at true scalability. Then we are defining what availability means. And that's where we can do our duty of care, whether it is to our employees, whether it is to our service providers, whether it is to the IT operations, whether it is to our supply chain or any stakeholder. Thank you very much for listening to me. Now I'm ready to take some questions, Bob.
Wonderful. Thanks, Prashant. And if you do have any questions here for Prashant, you can locate the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll get to as many of these as we can today, but Prashant and the Everbridge team will have access to these questions. We'll follow up with everyone and every question we don't get to here today after the webinar's ended. So first question here, how do you get an enterprise to look more at the platform that system resides on more than a single asset outage, more holistically approach?
Yeah, basically there are multiple factors here, right? Now, we can get a little more technical here, but from the perspective of looking at, today there are concepts of what we call as Holden days RAID disks, right? What we call, I can loosely call it as redundant arrays of inexpensive disks. Nowadays, the world is moving to the idea of redundant array of inexpensive servers. So while we are talking about server clusters, clusters themselves should be scalable, right? So when we are looking at those assets at the endpoint systems, we want to make sure that you're not depending upon a single point of failure from the perspective of the geolocation, whether it is from the perspective of the IP addresses that you depend on, whether you're looking at the physical location of that single asset, or you're looking at the downstream dependency. In the world of supply chain or in the world of IT operations, we call them origin-destination pairs, right? If you have a product service location, what is the origin of it? What are the downstream dependencies? What are the upstream dependencies? Now map your assets and what we call them as service dependency map, resulting in what we know them as consequence maps. So if you can do the simulation exercise to look at your assets, look at what you care about, where they are located, build a service dependency map, and then subject it to a simulated critical event to understand the consequence map, then you will be able to prepare better for this kind of an event.
All right, next question. Can you talk about related topics like having a platform that supports concept of identity management, roles, authentication?
Absolutely. One of the critical things that I probably should have covered during this webinar, which I didn't, is to make sure that while we're looking at resiliency and scalability, we did touch upon data privacy, right? We did touch upon security and compliance. And part of that, during the time of crisis, is who has access to what data? What kind of role-based access controls do you have? Can you seamlessly log into the system using, let's say, a single sign-on solution? Do you have public key encryption, right? What does your provider offer for auditing functions? Maybe for a certain type of events, you're supposed to provide a compliance report to say who logged in, who did what, who carried out the actions, who rotated the passwords, right? Who sent out the emergency communication. I'll give you an example, both from an IT perspective and from the perspective of non. The missile, the false missile news that came from Hawaii, where they thought that somebody had launched a missile. That's a public warning system. And from that government office, an indication went out saying missile has been fired. Now that's a lack of control on role-based side. There's a lack of control on the approval side, the lack of control on the audit side. On the IT operations side, making sure that the right people have access to the data that you're looking at. What kind of data are you looking at that might be violating a PII, right? If you're doing clinical operations and you're breached, what kind of records are you trying to access? How quickly are you quarantining? So single sign-on, role-based access control, public key encryptions, provider offered sub-accounts, right? How many service instances? whether the resolution process happened headless through a set of APIs, or the APIs as secure as the login. All these factors play a key role, and vendors must be challenged to make sure that they provide reports, compliance, certifications, and features and capabilities that align across these concepts of, like you called, identity management, authentication, role-based access control, and compliance audits.
All right. For monitoring of SaaS platforms, do you rely on their public dashboards or do you put additional monitoring or contact outreach in place?
Oh, yes to all, right? Like I said, even the monitoring systems that are in place are subject to the exact same vulnerability, right? Don't want to name a very large customer, but their security operations center and the monitoring system for their supply chain was based right in the path of the typhoon. And when the typhoon hit in the South China Sea, the diabetes medicine, believe it or not, that was supposed to arrive in the eastern shores of the United States never arrived. But the sad part was they didn't even know that it is not arriving, right? So when we look at the monitoring systems at the stack level, at the component level, we must have multiple layers of redundancy. If you're depending upon a telco infrastructure provider, what's their monitoring? How are you going to dovetail that monitoring system with yours? Somewhere when you go up the food chain, you're looking at the shipping routes. You're looking at the weather data. You're looking at travelers' data of who's going there. So now we're looking at traveler system. So when we talk about monitoring system, we also need to know what are the things that are interrelated and how do we make sure that we are able to provide correlation between multiple monitoring systems looking at different dimensions of it. Travelers' data, supply chain data, weather data, backend data, database monitoring tool, middleware tool, API layers, UI layers, mobile layers, and the mobile apps that depend on cloud service providers. What sort of monitoring tools that we can get and build redundancy throughout the platform stack and monitor them from multiple locations to make sure that we have true picture of when an outage occurs. You have a correlated, orchestrated signal, and you can eliminate noise from the system.
All right, we've got time for one more question here. What technologies do the large enterprise like Google and Facebook use to achieve redundancy and scalability both at the same time?
I think I talked a little bit about this. I mean, we did talk about the concept of RAID. Now there is a concept, called RAISE, which is Redundant Area of Inexpensive Servers, right? Google and Facebook specifically leverage this concept a lot. So if you go and do the reading on what they believe in, they do talk about elastically and on-demand extending scalability technologies, right? They will make sure, obviously provided with the right billing and invoice in place, they will make sure that they are taking an array of inexpensive servers and rapidly scaling them. They obviously do it for themselves, right? Or you can look at any of the big data giants that are out there. They will use less powerful nodes, but multiple of those, because the force multiplier is in trying to make 1 + 1 = 11 rather than 6 + 5 = 11. So essentially the point of the technology adoption, the way it's going, the way DevOps is moving, the way we talk about salt stacks, rapid deployment, quick testing, we are looking at the concept of scalability that are designed using less powerful nodes, cheaper servers that scale really quickly, can be deployed and provisioned quickly, rather than taking a massive server that has huge amounts of capacity, but a single outage can have deep ramifications. So those are the typical technologies that folks like Google and Facebook use.
All right, wonderful. There's several questions we did not get to today. So again, Prashant and the Everbridge team will follow up with everyone after the webinar has ended. Any parting words here today, Prashant?
Well, first, thank you very much, folks, listening to it. We take this very passionately at Everbridge. All the concepts that we talk about, we are day in and out worrying about it. As you folks know, whether it is wildfires in California, IT outages, supply chain in China, China, or stuff originating from China, coronavirus that we're talking about, active shooters. Unfortunately, we help our customers. I say unfortunately because these are unfortunate events, but we are in a great position to offer the best of our services. And these are the concepts that we discussed today that we take really seriously. We're extremely passionate about it. And we hope you hold us accountable and to the very best of standards when it comes to these concepts. So thank you very much for listening to us today.
All right, wonderful. Thanks again, everyone, for your attendance here today. We again hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank Prashant for his time here today, as well as Everbridge for sponsoring today's webinar. We will be emailing everyone a link to the recording. You may view that recording as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar.